Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dan Bates with the Greater Hamilton Chamber of Commerce. We're excited today to bring you yet another episode of The Conversation. Today, our facilitator is Byron Skaggs once again, works with successful business owners, leaders, and executives facing new opportunities or simply feeling stuck. He is a certified professional business coach and an entrepreneurial-minded individual with over 25 years of professional executive management experience spanning business, education, and nonprofit sectors. Byron co-founded and operated U.S.-based corporation and facilitated a successful sale and transition to new operators. While in Egypt, he initiated a consulting project resulting in his creating and launching an advancement office for a prestigious private international school that serves clients including the U.S. Embassy and other embassies, USAID, United Nations, Coca-Cola International, and many other transnational organizations. He serves as a consultant for marketing and communications projects in the Middle East and North Africa region, and as a business consultant to several small to medium enterprises in Egypt, the UK, European Union, and the United States. Thank you for being with us, Byron.
Thank you.
We're really excited today. Our special guest is Marc Messerschmidt. Marc was raised in Hamilton, Ohio, and is enlisted in the U.S. Army as a private in November of 1990. As a non-commissioned officer, he served as a squad leader and platoon sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division and as a ranger instructor at Fort Benning, Georgia. He pursued a college degree while on active duty and earned his commission through the Officer Candidate School in 1999. As an Army officer, Marc held multiple leadership positions from rifle platoon leader to battalion executive officer with the elite 75th Ranger Regiment at Fort Benning, Georgia. Marc deployed to combat a total of 6 times in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia, and he commanded 3 infantry companies to include the U.S. Sniper School. Marc was the winner of the 2000 David E. Grange Jr. Best Ranger competition, and Marc was inducted as a distinguished member of the Airborne Ranger Training Brigade in 2015. After nearly 22 years of military service, Marc retired as a major in June of 2012. He earned his master-rated parachute badge with Combat Jump Star, the Combat Expert Infantryman badge, the Ranger Tab, the Pathfinder Badge, and the Sniper Skill Identifier. Marc's awards include the Legion of Merit, 2 Bronze Stars, the Purple Heart, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, 3 Meritorious Service Medals, 10 Army Commendation Medals, and 3 Army Achievement Medals. Marc Messerschmidt is currently employed as a senior process leader with the MillerCoors Trenton Brewery, and he is on-site leader for MillerCoors Veterans Group. Marc sits on the Veterans Committee for the Heroes Fund in Westchester, Ohio, and he also volunteers for numerous fundraising and community outreach events every year. In addition, he recently started teaching organizational leadership at Miami Regionals. Marc is a graduate of Troy University in Troy, Alabama, earning a Master's of Science degree in Management, and he now resides in Hamilton. Thank you for joining us, Marc.
Glad to be here.
With that, I'm turning it over to our facilitator. Enjoy the conversation, and we will follow up at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate the chance to be with you again here at the Greater Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, and for the conversation. This is our 4th event now, and Marc wanted to say thank you first for your service to our country.
Thank you for recognizing that.
Really appreciate that very much.
Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
And then also just thank you for your willingness to take some time out of your day and your week to be with us for this conversation. The book that we're basing our discussion off of is Extreme Ownership. That was written by 2 Navy SEALs, Jocko Willink. See, this is, I've said I was going to actually get these down, but Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. But they wrote Extreme Ownership. Some of it based on their experiences in active combat with the Navy SEALs, and then how they have teased out of that some business and more specifically leadership principles that tie into how to literally own your own life and own the actions and become a better leader to those around. So we're going to dig right into this, and I'm excited to be able to have Marc here because he can actually help us, literally from his own experience, tease out how some of these pieces have played out in his life and what that looks like in his own experience in the private sector, as well as maybe even some examples or things from his own experience in the military. And so really appreciate your willingness to do this. And as we talked recently, just your excitement for the principles that are here, your excitement and your commitment. And I laughed, but you were like, he's written so many notes and this is fantastic. So I want to just tell you again, don't hesitate at all to reference those if you need them.
Sure.
And happy to do that. So before we get into the text, I want to make sure that we set our expectations. And if you can just agree with me that we have kind of an establishment of how we're going to function through this, through the next hour and a half together. And that is, the first thing is just for you to think for a second, to what level do you want to be engaged in this conversation? And from 1 to 10, maybe up on the top, if you've got a little piece of note paper or something up in the top corner, just from 1 to 10, what level of engagement do you expect to have in what we're talking about today? I'm not asking for that you answer, but just think to yourself. You may be going, somebody just told me that I needed to come here, or maybe somebody said, hey, if you go to the conversation, we'll give you extra points at work. Can't imagine that would actually be the case. But maybe you're actually here because you truly do want to be engaged. So what I'm going to ask next is that you take a moment and set your environment. Set the environment around you to meet the expectation that you hope to achieve during this time. So if that means turning off your cell phone, if that means leaving things in your bag or not having so many distractions, whatever that is, set yourself so that you can be engaged to the level that you want to be able to achieve during our time. So with that, one other thing, if you are watching online, and we're very grateful that you are, we've had in the past number of conversations, we've had many who've been watching online, which is great. When you're online, there is a feature to be able to do questions and answer, or to submit questions. And we do have Tiffany here that is helping to facilitate those questions. So if you've got questions from wherever you are, please feel free to ask those questions, and we will field those here. And we'll also have conversations from those that are live with us in the audience. So we're grateful for both those in the room and for those that are online with us now. And let's dig in. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
Okay. So extreme ownership. All right. Just the title. What is the first impression when Dan asked you about this process in the book? What was your first impression of the title of the book and what it conveyed?
So Dan reached out to me a couple weeks ago and he said, we've got this book called Extreme Ownership, and it was written by a couple of Navy SEALs, and he said, I think you would be really good to come in here and review this book. So I started to peel the onion back, and I wanted to think about who Navy SEALs are. And as Dan read my biography, I have a lot of special operations experience, and Navy SEALs are special operations units. And I've had an opportunity to work with them on many times. So I know what a SEAL looks like, and SEALs are extremely driven, motivated, competent people. They will not accept failure. They will not accept loss, and they're very good at what they do. So I already had a good understanding of what a SEAL was, and when I heard the title Extreme Ownership, I kind of related that to my own experience. And what that means to me is that you're part of something that is larger than you, and you are totally bought in, you're totally committed, and you are all about seeing whatever it is that you're committed to being successful. And considering that it was written by a couple of U.S. Navy SEALs, that is commitment to the unit, to the mission, and to each other. Because when you think about the types of high-risk, high-reward missions that SEALs are asked to do, should something go wrong, it typically means loss of blood, loss of life, something along those lines. So they have to be bought in, they have to be committed to each other, and they have to have extreme ownership.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you were, when we talked recently, you mentioned kind of the caliber of the Navy SEAL teams. Can you speak to that again, and just in maybe kind of help us understand what that might look like in a different industry or sport.
So the analogy that I used is, the Navy SEALs is kind of like being in the Pro Bowl. They're at a much higher level than the average sailor. And the analogy that I used with you was being the Pro Bowl, and that's from my own experience in the 75th Ranger Regiment. And most organizations that I served in on active duty, I was always, a top 10% kind of officer. I just was. But when I served in the 75th Ranger Regiment, I had to put everything I had into being average, because the caliber of the people that I served with was so good that being average was a good day. And that says a lot about the organization when you've put everything that you've got into what you're doing, and at the end of the day you walk away and you drive home and you think, I was just average today. That's not a bad place to be.
Sure. And that, honestly, when Marc mentioned that to me, that really kind of opened a whole new layer of understanding to what they're writing about in this book. Because I understood that the nature of, their professional special operations, all the different pieces. But when Marc goes, no, these guys were, it's one thing to be an NFL professional player. It's a whole nother thing to be one of those elite pieces, team members that make the Pro Bowl, and to do that consistently. And for that was a piece for me. It was like, oh my goodness, it's a whole other layer above and beyond what I even brought to the table of understanding that. So sure. I appreciate that analogy. Just it helped me. I don't know if it helps you at all, but just to know that the level of commitment and the all the pieces that they actually put into this book to help us understand how to become better leaders ourselves. So the book is broken down into 3 different sections, and that's what we have with the slides. The PowerPoint pieces are quite simple today, but they're broken into 3 different sections, and they talk about first the war within, and that's the first section. And there's principles that are tied to that we're going to talk about. The second section of the book was called the laws of combat, and that really was in how do you engage in leadership in ways that can move your organization forward. And then the last section was some ideas on how to sustain that level of leadership and sustain the victory and continue to move forward. So let's begin by looking at just the war within. What are some of the pieces and the obstacles, the things that we have to deal with internally? From a military perspective, these are also very true principles to how we lead our own lives and how we lead our organizations, regardless of whether we've had military experience or not. At least I hope so.
Sure.
But walk us through the first one. The first principle is just literally the title, extreme ownership. What are your thoughts on that first section on extreme ownership?
So it goes back to what I talked about in the very beginning. It's being part of something larger than yourself. So the analogy that they use from their combat experience is that they are totally committed to their unit and totally committed to each other. If you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? You're a chain, and if that link breaks, then obviously it breaks the effort. So everybody there is committed to the organization. Physically, they want to be as strong as they can be. They want to have the endurance and the stamina to be able to hang for the mission. They want to be experts with their weapons, their equipment, and things like that. And then they want to go more to the collective level, and they want to be totally engaged in small unit tactics and so forth, so that they all work together as a team towards a common goal. And then they talk about that and how they translate that into the private sector, which is really no different than what most of us see in our everyday lives. So whether you're a member of a sports team, or you're a member of a nonprofit organization, or you're in the private sector working in industry somewhere, you've got to be totally committed to something, and you look at it as my team depends on me, I depend on them. We build relationships, we build trust, and we all own something, and we all work towards a common goal. And by doing that, we're going to move the organization forward. We're going to have success.
And that's a great idea. But how does that translate to those moments when we run into something that is truly, seemingly holding us back. That question of what do we do when we literally hit a point of failure? And what does that mean for extreme ownership?
So within extreme ownership, and it's really like with anything else, I've made a career in manufacturing since I left the military, and you get into basically a root cause analysis of what your issues are, and you systematically dissect the problem until you get down to where those challenges lie, and then you develop and you plan so that you can go in and you can piece by piece disassemble that problem until it is eventually taken out of the way. And the way that you do that is that you have strong leaders at every level. You have influence up and down the chain of command, so that leaders at the top are talking to leaders in the middle who are talking to the subordinates down at the bottom, and it works in every direction. You build trust, you build confidence in each other, and you work through your problem. And once you do that and you start to win, winning becomes contagious.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah. What's fascinating is you've put that into a manufacturing analogy in a context. And what strikes me is those same words can actually be kind of threatening if we are the leader ourselves, and we're recognizing that failure may be something that's internal. And it's not necessarily a manufacturing process in an external sense, but maybe it is a manufacturing process internally. And what, these are just some of the questions I'm going to throw out, but what is it about how we function with those around us, with those who we report to, those who report to us, to become the kind of leader that we literally go down that process of analyzing that particular failure. I don't know about you, but sometimes if I have a moment of failure, that's the last thing I want to talk about. But the only way to move forward is to actually work through it. And sometimes it actually takes maybe even another group of people around us who can sit there and talk us through that piece so that we can become that better leader and owning those failures. That's what this extreme ownership is about. It's not that you don't fail. It's that you don't blame somebody else. It's that you own the successes and you own the failures and everything around that. And that's some of the hardest work we have to do.
That's a great transition into the second chapter.
And we're only on the first principle. But let's get to so let's get into the second chapter. There are no bad teams.
There are only bad leaders.
Only bad leaders. Tell us about that.
So think of it like this, right? You can delegate authority, but you can't delegate responsibility. You are responsible for what your organization has done or what your organization has failed to do. As the leader, you have to own it. You have to be accountable. And let's think about it for a second, right? So if you break this problem down, if HR does what they're supposed to do and they screen applicants the way that they're supposed to screen applicants, and you hire the right people, and your learning and your development puts in together a training path, and they train people for success, and your logistical supply chain provides them with the materials and the resources and everything that they need, and all of the equipment that they're required to do their job is serviceable, functions, and works the way that it should. There's really no reason why they shouldn't be able to accomplish the task or the mission or whatever it is. So if for some reason your organization is failing, you have to ask yourself, have I provided all those things? And if you've provided all those things, then you have to look and you say, well, maybe I'm not doing something right. Maybe my intent wasn't clear. Maybe I didn't clearly communicate what it is that I want them to do. Maybe the task wasn't identified. Maybe I didn't give them the purpose and explain to them why this is important. Maybe I didn't explain to them what my intent is and where I want them to go with it and how I want them to move forward. So those are all things that you have to consider as a leader, because at the end of the day, it's your failure is your failure. It's not your team has failed. You have failed as a leader.
And to kind of bounce off of that, and we'll get into communication in a little bit in the next section, but this idea of, even when you look at that list, you talk about HR or you look at training, there's that sense that if you're responsible as the leader of those different operations and those different channels within, you may not specifically be in charge of those, but if something didn't happen correctly in that particular arena of the organization, you still own some responsibility to help them clarify what's needed, and to, so that they're looking for the right kind of person. If I understand that correctly, that's kind of that idea of, they feed somebody to you and you go, well, that's not the right person, they messed up. Maybe it's a matter of going back and saying, okay, let's clarify what we're actually looking for, and work from it that direction.
Let's take a step back and let's take another layer off the onion.
Yeah.
So as Dan mentioned in my biography, recently I was blessed with an opportunity to teach some classes to juniors and seniors at Miami Regionals, and I was teaching a leadership, organizational leadership course. And one of the questions that I posed to the students as part of a discussion board is, what's the difference between a leader and the difference between a manager? Mm-hmm. And really, that's a complex question that you'll get a lot of different opinions on. But as far as I'm concerned, really what it comes down to is leaders inspire and they influence. Managers direct and they supervise. So if you're a leader within an organization, you have to understand your organization. You have to understand what motivates your organization. You have to understand how you can get people to follow you. You have to understand how you can inspire. As a manager, you're gonna be more of a director and a supervisor, and making sure that tasks are getting done, the systems. Right. So I've known great leaders that were terrible managers, and I've known great managers that were terrible leaders. If you can put the two together, then you've got something that's really special, and that's what everybody should strive for. So kind of going back to, there's no bad teams, only bad leaders. As you look at where your issues are and what's preventing you from being successful, is it a function of leadership? Is it a function of management? And that opens up a whole different discussion on where your problems are and how you should go after that.
Yeah. We have a question. Okay, thank you.
More just a statement and question. They said, I truly believe people don't quit their job, they quit their boss. Is this true or not?
There's certainly an awful lot of people online that write articles about that believe that is the case. I've read articles where most people don't leave the company, they leave their boss. Mm-hmm. I've been very fortunate. I've never really had a boss that ran me off. Mm-hmm. I've never really had a boss that I didn't enjoy working for. So I can't really answer that question. But I'm sure there's people out there that have opinions on it.
Yeah. What about anybody here in the I'm seeing a nodding, yes.
Oh, absolutely. And you say in the industry, you just go somewhere else. That's a sign you didn't leave the job, like you got the same job, you just went to a different company.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And that's I mean, I think there is a combination of, sometimes you do chase something or an opportunity presents itself, and so you move on for your own personal growth or those kind of pieces. But I think the leadership of the boss does play a big role in that, because I would think that if you have a boss who is understanding what the process is going on, they will be doing what they can to empower you to be a better leader in the place where you are, and that growth and that process continues, so that you don't ever really feel the sense where you need to leave. So that could very much play a role in that process. I appreciate the question, because that is a real challenge, and that idea of no bad teams, just bad leaders. The example that they give in the book, which I thought was fascinating, but you were talking about in their training times, they had different boat teams and a leader of each boat team, and they would go through a series of races, and there was always one team, I think it was team 2, that always won every race, and team 6 was perpetually in last place among the 7 or 8 teams that they had going up. And of course, the team 2 leader was excited about what they were doing, and they had a great team, and they were happy. They were always, moving forward because they loved to win. And the team 6 was always fighting, and there was bickering going on, and all these things, And the team 6 leader really thought that he had been given a bad team. And at one point, the leadership of the whole training switched the leaders. And immediately Team 6 began outperforming and battling Team 2 for the first place win at the race every time. And so it was literally proving the point that it's not about the team, it's about the leader and what they instill in their team.
So as we think about places that we've worked and organizations that we've been a part of, it's been my experience both in the military and in the private sector that organizations a lot of times will take on the personality of the leader. And you can see, a leader that, is very passionate and that everybody's behind and everybody leaves or loves, and then that leader leaves the organization and somebody comes in with a different leadership approach. You can kind of see the whole organization has to adjust to the leader.
Sure.
So that's one of those things that's just, it's natural, it's a change.
Yeah.
So using the example of the two boat teams, Team 2 would always win, Team 6 would always lose. They switched leaders, and when they did that, Team 2 was still winning, but Team 6 got significantly better.
Yeah.
So why was Team 2 still continuing to win? Because it had taken on the personality of the previous leader, and they knew what right looked like. They had high expectations. They were accountable for themselves and for each other, and they continued to perform at a very high level, even though you put a new leader in the mix. And then you took the leader who had got that boat team to the level where it was at, and you brought it over to the team that was struggling, and that leader was able to influence and inspire and get the most out of the organization and brought that other team forward. So one of the things in the military that, love it or not, it was the way that it was, is that typically, every 3 to 4 years, leaders get moved around. One of the reasons that they do that is, change is good. And, I would see people that, they would do their 2 to 3 years, and then they would move somewhere else, and a new leader would come in, and the organization continued to grow and continue to develop. It prevents complacency. So, and it helps leaders to continue to grow and develop. I commanded 3 companies. It was the same job in every company, but I did it 3 times, and I had to use a different leadership style and a different leadership approach to every company that I commanded, because each company had a different mission. They had different personalities. They had different people.
Yeah.
And to be an adaptive leader, you have to understand your organization. And sometimes you as a leader will have to change. If you don't, you're not going to have success.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a key word that you just used that I think plays a huge role in this whole process: an adaptive leader. Now, if you were to tell me right from the beginning, and me not having any kind of military experience, I would not think a military person as having an adaptive leadership style, or just being adaptive, period. Because there's a sense that there's always a regimented piece. But I think we will see and discover as we move forward through this process that it's through this process of training and the other pieces that are put into place that becoming adaptive is literally the fruit of that work and the labor that's involved here. And so I hope that by the time we're finished, I want to be able to come back around to this, because there's another term that I think is very similar to this, and that's transformative leadership. And that's that notion of transforming ourselves from the inside, becoming the kind of leader we want to be and that we envision, and then that begins to feed out to those that we are actually leading. We lead ourselves first, and then we lead others. And so that leads to the third principle, and that's belief. Belief in the team, belief, when that example of the boat leader from Team 2 going to Team 6, he still knew that he had good people in that team, but he needed to believe that they could become better than where they were.
Right.
And so talk to us about the belief process.
So this comes to total buy-in and commitment to the organization, and total buy-in and commitment to each other. And to get to that point, there has to be trust and confidence in each other. And the example that they used in the book is that some SEAL leaders were being asked to go out on dismounted patrols working with Iraqi soldiers, and Iraqi soldiers weren't trained anywhere to the level that the SEALs were. There was a lot of concern that serving with these soldiers who didn't have the training, didn't have the discipline, was going to lead to American casualties and stuff like that. But it was an important mission because you needed to get the Iraqis engaged and start learning how to provide their own security and start to build their own military so that they could provide their own defense. So the SEALs approached the mission in that this is very important and that we have to believe in this and we have to make this work because it's in our best interest at a strategic level, maybe not necessarily at a tactical level. And the way that you do that is that you build trust and confidence. And I've had a lot of people tell me over the years that trust is something that you have to earn, and it takes years to earn trust. You've got to get past that in a lot of situations, because I've been in situations in the military and really even in the private sector where we parachuted into Afghanistan October 19th, 2001 as part of the invasion. And I had new Rangers showed up to my platoon literally a week before we got on the plane. So I had to trust that they had been screened and selected. I had to trust that they had been trained, and I had to trust that they were going to do what they needed to do when we got into Afghanistan. And they did that. Fast forward 20 years, and I find myself working in a packaging department at MillerCoors, and I come in where I know nobody. And I have to trust that people are going to bring me in and they're going to help me and they're going to show me what right looks like and make me a successful member of the team. So, that's how you start to believe, is when you get the trust and confidence. The next way that you do it is through training. It kind of goes back to the example we used early on. You got the right people and they're trained. You have to believe that they're going to do the right things. And if they're not, then you have to go back and you have to evaluate where you are as an organization. The next piece to this is, demonstrated abilities, and you use KPIs or use metrics or whatever it is that your organization uses, and you evaluate where you are in relationship to your standards, and you want to ensure that people at every level are performing where that they should. And if they're not, then it goes back to the training. What training do you need to get them to perform at the right level? And then above all else, and one of the things that they don't talk about it a lot in the book, but I think it's a key point, is lead by example. I had a boss when I was in the military, and I'll never forget this guy. He told me one time, he said, Messerschmidt, never pass up an opportunity to show the world just how professional you can be. And I took that to heart, and I've always tried to put my best foot forward. I've always, in any situation, I've always tried to be as professional as I could be in those situations, because people see that and people watch that and people are inspired by that.
Yeah. Thank you. That idea of leading by example is tremendous, and I think that's going to also go right into the next principle. But I want to make sure
I thought it was interesting bringing up, sometimes you have to understand strategy over tactics.
Yes.
Because tactical data, I work in a very data-driven mindset. However, strategy, long-term strategy, if I only went by what is quickest now, I would often do everything. I came up in the finance world and I could have done everything myself and never trained anybody to do it. Strategic, tactically in that moment, it made sense. It got people in and out. Everything was done correctly, but the long-term strategy, I think it's that balance. I thought that was very interesting. You have to think of this, you have to balance both.
Yes.
So how do you overcome that? What do you think?
Sometimes just yelling at myself. In my experience, I've been a manager before, thank God. I always say, thank God I'm not currently, but it was having to discipline myself. It was first I could discipline myself and I think the next point, which is the ego, and say, I'm not bigger than this. I'm one person. As much as I believe I have all these abilities and powers, I can't always be here.
Well, think of it as a chain, right? You're a link in the chain. And, if you've got 40 links laying on the floor, you can't really do anything with just one link. But if you take those links and you put them all together and you make a chain, now you can hook it to a truck and you can pull a truck. So kind of talk about the strategic versus the tactical. When you're a single link in that chain, but you're not connected to anything, you're looking at things tactically. But
and you'll stress it out and break it really quickly versus spreading that workload.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, you're kind of that notion of the different links, and each link having a certain strength, but you put them together, and the strength is exponentially multiplied. From a different perspective, when you think tactical, you're very, very close to the action, and you're very, very close to the problem. From a strategic level, you can see a whole lot more of the playing field and what's going on in other places, and you can begin to see things that are actually maybe taking place completely outside of the view of the tactical level. But if you see that, and at a strategic level, you can begin to anticipate what needs to happen. And so that truly is one of those pieces of, that example of helping the rest of your team see the bigger picture sometimes, because we truly can get very myopic and pointed to just what we have to do and what we're tasked with today or this week. And the strategic level is pulling out, seeing it from a different level, but not just going, oh, okay, now I get it. It's then taking that and communicating it to the rest of the team. And the buy-in and the belief happens when everybody begins to see the bigger picture. Not that everybody has to do it or figure it out, but when they can begin to see that what they're doing at a tactical level is truly making a difference at a high strategic level, the buy-in is tremendous.
Your view of the world is based on your vantage point, right?
Yep.
The way you see things is where you're seated. And the History Channel did a story, I don't know, it's probably been a year ago or so, and it was called War Stories, The Battle for Haditha. And it was a story based around a Ranger raid that took place on the largest hydroelectric facility in Western Iraq. And you can look at it as either fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to be there, but I got an opportunity to be a part of that. And they did this documentary, and it was about a 60-minute documentary. And as I watched it, they had people who were on the ground giving their eyewitness accounts. So I was at a more strategic level, and they were at a more tactical level. And I was listening to some of these guys talk about their perspectives. And as I was listening to it, I was like, that's not the way I saw it. I saw it much differently based off of where I was.
Interesting.
It's very interesting. Yeah. I mean, they were telling their version of the story and what they saw. But to your point, I was at a much higher level. My vantage point was much different.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that also plays into when you think about the HR piece. If you are even functioning in a small business where it's you and just a couple people, in my experience in the work that I do with business owners, I hear time and time again challenges of finding the right people or hiring the right people or not even being able to keep people long enough. And the struggle continues to come around. And what my questions usually then start going down the road of, well, what have you done to establish training and the expectations, or what are you agreeing for them to do in a job description or to have things written down? And 9 times out of 10, the business owner is going, oh, I haven't done that. We as business owners sometimes, or leaders in organizations, we get so caught up in what we have to do today, what we have to do tomorrow, and the tactical things, we forget that our job is to be strategic and literally develop those things ourselves if we don't have them. So it's important that things get written down. It's important that if we have that knowledge, get it on paper, impart that to the rest of the team. That's how you build your team. That's how you find you better employees, is you train them to be the employees you want them to be.
Sure. One of the things we used in the military is it was called a battalion SOP, Standard Operating Procedure. Yeah. And I was a young captain, and that was my job, was to write that and maintain that. And it was a living document, but it was the basis for everything that we did. So kind of to your point, we all have to have something procedurally in place that we follow, regardless of, like in the job that I have right now, we have what we refer to as leader standard work. And it's basically my roadmap for the day. This is what I do when I get there. This is what I do after my first meeting, after my second meeting. And it just kind of creates for lack of better terms, a battle rhythm as to how I move through the day or through the week or through the month.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, that's so. You said living document. explain what a living document is, just in case there's somebody that may not know what that is.
So we're going to talk about this a little bit later, I think, in one of the other chapters. But basically,
If we are, we don't have to do that just
well,
yet.
an analogy I was going to use is never fall in love with your plan, right?
Okay.
Be willing to change your plan. So as with your standard operating procedure, it's a living document. You know, you may find that the conditions have changed. You may find that the organization has moved in a different direction. You may find that the structure of the company is now different. So when something changes in the organization, the document that governs the organization needs to change.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you. Any questions or thoughts? I mean, I realize we've kind of been really plowing ahead. Yes, Dan.
You know, with extreme ownership, and you are referring to the different links of the chain and that type of thing, you know, it's mentioned in the book about getting people on board, or, you know, kind of plucking them from the team. So how do you, if you have a member of the team that is not up to the standard of where everyone else is, and there seems to be an unwillingness to go there, are there certain triggers, or are there certain things that, you know, there's certain strategies or whatever to further try to get that person on board with performing at the same level of the rest of the team?
So one of the things that we kind of talked about was, particularly in the military, is, you know, in the private sector we call them key performance indicators, or KPIs, but in the military we had what was referred to as a mission essential task list. And basically it started at the very highest levels, where there were a series of tactical operational tasks that had to be required. For example, you know, airfield seizure, where you parachute onto an airfield. And then there were certain things within that task that migrated down to the company, or they had to maybe do a company raid, you know, where they would go into a building and they would secure that building. And then you had, you break it down to the next level, and it was platoon, fire, and maneuver, for example. And then you would break it down to the individual level, and they had to be able to operate as a member of a rifle squad. So all these tasks were nested. So to answer your question specifically, if you've got an individual who's not meeting expectations and is performing, then what you need to do is you need to go through where that person is as an individual and see, okay, well, in terms of individual tasks, you're either trained, you're partially trained, you're untrained, whatever your metric is, and say, we need to get you trained right here. This is something, being partially trained on this is a critical task, and we've got to get you to that point. So you give them the tools that they need to be successful. You give them the training that they need to be successful. You give them the support that they need. You give them the time, because you can bring most people forward. You also need to explain to them, you know, task, purpose, and intent. You know, your task is to operate this machine, and the purpose is so that we can put these beer cans into this box, and I want you to do however many a minute, so that we can get these boxes into the back of a truck and out on a grocery store shelf. So you break it down to them, and you give them the opportunity. And then if they don't perform at that point, then it starts becoming more corrective action at that time.
So everything I know about the SEAL teams is, because I have an adorable life, it's just from what I see on the news and read in the news. And I'm thinking of the situation with, when you said raid, it sparked the Osama bin Laden raid, and one SEAL out of that entire team went off the reservation, went entirely against protocol, and started to say, like, I did this, and the thing I felt was interesting, instead of what I see with most teams, where somebody's decided they're just going to, like, ruin morale, they're going to ruin that, and instead of, like, devolving down to that point, the rest of the SEAL team remained steady to their training and their procedure, which was, we don't discuss this, we're not going to comment. And instead of, because I've been on teams where it felt really good, and then one person drove them down. And of course, in most companies, it's not quite that extreme, but it's that same, but we're going to stay up here instead of allow the entire team to go down. It's kind of knowing when to cut the chain too.
So one of the things that you'll read in a lot of military books is quiet professionalism. And that is at the foundation of special operations, and really it's the foundation of a lot of things with military. You'll see, in special operations units and maybe even where you work, you got people poking each other and ribbing each other and building camaraderie and, making the day enjoyable. But at the end of the day, in extreme ownership type scenarios, we're all as big as we are together. And I've got my personal opinions on violating disclosure agreements and going public like that. That's not something personally that I would have ever done. But you did bring up a very important part, that you saw nobody else come forward after that had happened. So I think that kind of goes back to the whole team concept and how they're part of something bigger than themselves.
This is really fascinating. The question about what to do with a team member. I would begin by asking some of the questions of what are some of the agreements that are in place between you and that team member, and to some degree, what are either pieces that are written down or stated related to the mission and goal of the organization, the specific job tasks, those, kind of broken down to a variety of things. Before you can go too far down that road is identifying what are the things that you truly want to see performed from that particular position or that particular individual. And then it's a matter of kind of backing up and then having that conversation. And from a not just a tactical perspective, but backing up to a strategic level of, can you see, I love that analogy. Okay, you may think that right here, you're just packing cans in a box. But if you don't pack cans in a box at a certain speed by which we can get things onto a pallet and into a truck at a certain speed or at a certain rate, then it misses this opportunity to be in the shelves, and we lose X number of dollars. I mean, you can literally point to the speed of this performance to a dollar sign at the end of the day. Now, some organizations may not be able to do that if they're working with people all the time, but there's still other things that are critical to the mission of that organization, to that business, that you do need to be able to tie into the bigger picture, and what you're doing is either helping us move forward or holding us back. And what can we do to fix that? And then I think in the case of the book, and what also comes here is this notion of, if there comes up a specific point where then it's no longer a subjective, well, I just don't like how you're doing this, or I don't like this or that. It can become much more objective. These particular agreements of how the job is to be performed are not being met. And that's where we need to make a change.
And think of it another way, one of those things that I said earlier on is you're responsible for what your organization does or fails to do. So maybe the person packing the cans in the box is not the problem. Maybe it's me. I'll give you an example. Hey, put those cans in a box, get them on that pallet. I don't care that your wife's 9 months pregnant, and I don't care that your kid's in the hospital. Pack those cans in that box. So really at that point, is it that person's problem, or is it really, are you the problem? Are you being the leader that you need to be? So I think you need to take a step back and take a look at the situation holistically. Sure. And it could be that maybe you're the problem. Maybe you're not giving this person the support that they need. Maybe this person has something going on outside of work, or that are outside of the plant that you can help with. So you have to look at everything as a leader. It goes back to knowing your organization. I would like to think, if you've got a standard operating procedure for your organization that's in place, where you say, this is the kind of person that we're going to recruit and that we're going to hire, and this is the selection criteria, and this is the training, and we go through all those steps and we get this person into the organization, and they're a productive member of the organization, and then all of a sudden their productivity levels drop. Something in this equation has changed, and we've got to figure out what that is. It could be, a lot of different things, but if you invest in your people, you will see a return on investment. And I've seen that in the military time and time again. I've had people in the military who, got themselves in trouble, and we gave them a second chance, and we worked worked through the issues with them, and some of them went on to do some amazing things at some of the highest levels in the Army. And I've also seen the same thing in the private sector where somebody got themselves in trouble and we were able to work through it, and they continue to be very valuable employees.
Yeah, yeah. No, this is really, I mean, I realize there's so much that we can pull out of this book that we can, the idea lead by example, you said that earlier. And you were saying that wasn't necessarily a part of the book. And I wonder though, if maybe it is in the construct of check your ego.
Mm-hmm.
You lead by example. The example you just gave of, sitting there saying to somebody like me, hey, I don't care what your life circumstances are going and what's going on outside of work, pack that box.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe leading by example is coming alongside and shouldering some of that burden as well and saying, hey, if you need help, let me help you get caught up to speed. And then later, we're going to sit down and talk about what's going on in this particular situation and how can we improve upon this for tomorrow. It's leading by example. It's stepping in and checking your ego and your leadership and your rank and everything else at the door and saying, I'm gonna step in to help make this happen now.
So one of the chapters in the book is actually called Check Your Ego, and it talks about a scenario in Iraq where two special operations units and a conventional Army unit all come together. And the analysis that we talked about with the SEALs and who they are, I mean, they're the top 0.1% of the Navy. The Rangers are the top 0.1% of the Army, and you've got people who are adrenaline freaks. You've got people who are fast and furious. They run through life with their hair on fire, just more afraid of failure than they are of bodily harm. That's who these people are, type A++ personalities. And I made the comment that I was in the middle of those people, and when you've got type A++ personalities, there will be friction at times. You can't take a group of people like this that are that driven and that motivated and that passionate and that extreme in everything that they do and expect that they're always going to agree on everything. And in the book, there's a scenario where these two units came together and they were struggling to work together because they couldn't check their ego and listen and communicate effectively. They couldn't listen to each other and that, hey, I've got an idea or you've got an idea. So I think that's important because, one of the things that we talked about in the very beginning is relationships are important. Relationships build people. And I've worked with people, throughout my career, and there's been times where I've worked with somebody that I didn't particularly care for, and they never knew it because I kept it very professional. I was very easy to work with. I would work my ideas with their ideas, and I didn't always get my way. I didn't always get their way. I was actually watching a show on TV the other night, and they said you can tell when you've had a good negotiation because both parties leave mad. So and you kind of think about it, and you don't always get what you want in a negotiation, but that you have to be willing to give and take in these scenarios. And in this particular scenario in the book, you had basically peers who didn't see eye to eye, and until one of them was able to check their ego, nothing moved forward.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions or comments? We've ended up spending quite a bit of time on just the first section of the book, which are 4 principles that I think are actually really critical. And the reason for that is because they deal with the internal part of who we are as the leader. The other aspects move to the external and how you do some of the operations and communication and other things. And those are still critical. But if we don't get this right, I think that's where many times we may struggle ourselves. Is from this point of the internal aspects of being the leader, and what does that mean? Even if we're not the leader of our organization, we still have a responsibility to lead ourselves and then lead those around us. And there's an understanding in many organizations that even if you're not the leader of the organization, you still play a role in helping to lead the organization by how you function in your role, how you function with those who answer to you, and how you function to those that you answer to. Yes.
So I guess a question I would have on that final front is we live very much in a time where owning failure and owning blame and owning responsibility for a problem is not seen necessarily at the highest points of leadership in many situations. And so it doesn't seem to be very popular. It seems to be, if you can negotiate your way out of a problem or negotiate your blame out, like it seems to be people's, that seems to be like a positive trait these days.
One of the things I've heard recently, and that's been an interesting concept, is embrace the red. Because if you embrace the red, it gives you opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So admitting you made a mistake, or admitting that you have a shortfall, or admitting that something's not going well, doesn't mean that you're not performing well. It means that you have opportunity to perform better, and you need to think about it like that. So if you go after those things that you're not doing well, you're not only going to make yourself better, you're going to make your team better, and you're going to make your organization better.
This is a fascinating thing because I think it truly speaks to culture, the culture of the organization, the culture of everything around. And do you feel, in a sense, empowered to be able to talk about your failure and not do that at a point where you're at risk of losing your job or something else, or maybe even something worse? There's some of those pieces that I think play into it, and that, so if you're in a leadership role, being very mindful of the type of culture you want to cultivate, and what is it that you do, the responsibility you have. Sometimes those comments or questions about the failure of somebody on your team really does kind of come back to you as the leader to say, okay, I need to do a little bit more thinking about how I contribute to this process. But yeah, it is I don't want to, we could go down a whole other rabbit trail of current culture and things that we see here. But it's also, my goodness, my experience being in different places around the world and different cultures lends a whole different set of conversations to these pieces. And yet some of these principles are very, very true, regardless of where you go, is helping people realize taking ownership. It's not blaming the system. It's not blaming somebody else, but it's taking ownership for what's not working.
So my question was, how do you do that from a position of strength, where you display strength rather than that you're pulling back, which can then become a problem in a whole different way?
What about the concept of admitting failure is not a strength?
It seems to be perception.
Okay.
And of course, perception's reality.
Perception of who? The perception
So
of the leader,
yeah.
or?
No, it's I've seen this in multiple companies I've worked for, and I've noticed the ones that do actually own up, they tend to come across as much stronger because they're accountable for this organization. They're going to hold us on their backs. But I think on a smaller level, especially you get to like mid managers, it's the feeling of, if I admit my own failure, it's my career. Or that fear of, yeah.
I think you're talking about organizational culture, and I think back to one time when I was in the military. We're not going into the specifics and and telling another war story, but there was a situation where I had a commander that made a mistake, and I'll never forget how powerful it was. He said, "You know what? That was my mistake, and that will not happen again." And I remember it's making the hair on my neck stand up right now as we talk about it, because he had done something that could have potentially got a lot of people killed, and he realized it, and he learned from it and moved forward. So I think perception is reality, and my perception was that was a very powerful moment, because he had learned something from that will never happen again. Yeah, we're talking kind of about talking about the leadership, and we're talking about working together, and we're talking about learning from mistakes and stuff. not to move ahead, but kind of moving ahead, this next chapter, I think, kind of is a good fit from where we're at and what we're talking about. And chapter 5 in this book is called Cover and Move. And it's kind of occurred to me as we're having a conversation around all this. This is all systematically linked, right? It's kind of an evolutionary process, kind of like I talked about, individual and collective skills, individual being at the individual level, moving as a member of a fire team, being proficient with the weapon, into more collective stuff like, being part of a company raid or being part of an airfield seizure. These things are all nested concepts and they all work together. And I saw the title of the chapter was Cover and Move, and I thought, what in the world does this have to do with anything in this book? This isn't necessarily a leadership thing. But after I read it, it's kind of almost a play on words, right? So one of the most basic things in terms of tactical movement in the military is they call it cover and move. We call it fire and maneuver. But essentially, it's mutually supporting teams moving tactically through an area where there's a threat. So in the book, the story was they had to move through an area and they depended on one team to set overwatch and engage the enemy and keep the enemy from engaging another team while that team moved. And you kind of create a leapfrog where you're bounding forward and you're moving, away from danger, you're moving towards danger, whatever the type of mission it is that you're doing. And I thought about that in an analogy that we use at MillerCoors in the Trenton Brewery, and that's how you get teams to work together, right? And you have to provide full disclosure, and you have to be open and honest with each other. And you have to communicate. I work in the packaging department, and I can have the best day in the world, but that doesn't mean anything if we can't get beer through the warehouse and get it out the back. Or, brewing that makes the beer, they can have the best day in the world, but if I can't get it into a can or get it into a bottle, then their day really wasn't that good. So within every organization, and I can't really think of a single organization where there aren't mutually supporting entities coming together for a common good. These are all powerful lessons. How you reach across the aisle, reach across, to the other part of the plant, reach to the other part of the office, bringing HR into training and putting together that screening process and that training process to get trained, qualified employees, out into the workforce. Working with other companies, for example, if you're into manufacturing, you've got to move your product. So your trucking company may not necessarily be within your organization, but they're a business partner, and you need to be able to reach across the aisle and establish that relationship with them. So it comes down to mutually supporting teams and elements all working towards a common goal, and that all comes down to the things that we've talked about up to this point. You're building trust and confidence, you're building relationships, you're working together as a team. So I didn't understand where they were going with this when I first read it. I thought, okay, this is going to be one of those Navy Civil War story chapters, but it really does fit into this book and how it talks about how you bring all these things together.
And the level of communication and cooperation that's necessary between those different teams so that they can function in a mutually supporting way. It's truly the concept of breaking down silos.
Sure.
If you're in an organization that seems to just function in these silos, and sometimes maybe even saying breaking down silos makes it sound very aggressive. Maybe it's just bending silos and creating opportunities where then they can touch and interface and figure out how they can work better together.
Sure.
Now, what's fascinating is I think if we take that from a large perspective organization and bring that down to a medium-sized business or a small business, what are some of those things that happen in those organizations where maybe I'm the solopreneur or maybe I'm one of 3 or 4 in my business? How do I take that idea of mutually supportive teams and what does that look like for me or for you as an individual in a small group? Who might those supportive teams be? I want you to think about that. If you're part of that kind of an organization, or you're on your own and you're working, you may be looking at this going, well, that doesn't translate to me at all. I think it does. And I want you to wrestle with that a little bit. Who are your mutually supporting teams, and how can you begin to work more effectively together? It may be somebody like Mark was saying, the trucking company. It's not somebody that was in their organization. It's an outside vendor, but they have to work together for the mutual success of both organizations. So if you're working in a small capacity as a solopreneur, as a small business, what can you do to be mutually supporting and working together with those that you interact with on a regular basis?
So I worked for a small company, my first job out of the Army, and when you're a small company, you do have limited resources, and we had offices in multiple different locations, and sometimes based off of changes in the environment or the way the business was going, all of a sudden we needed more resources in one office than the other. So we would work together to support each other, and there has to be prioritization when it gets to that point. So somebody has to provide command and control in those types of situations, right? So I had an office in Northern Kentucky, and all of a sudden I got this huge job that I needed to do, and I didn't have the people and I didn't have the resources, but they had the people and they had the resources in our Cincinnati office. So it required going to the boss and saying, "Hey boss, this is what I've got and this is what they've got. Where is your priority? Which we can only do so much, so we need you to identify what the priorities are, because let's face it, if everything's important, then really nothing's important." So you have to have priorities, and you have to go after those types of opportunities. And that was one of the things we did in the military. My last deployment, I was a chief of operations for a forwardly deployed special operations task force, and they would send all the assault forces would send me missions every night that they wanted to go out and they wanted to go do. And some would require helicopters here, some might require a surveillance plane here, some might require a gunship here. So I would get all these missions, and I would figure out what resources would have to go to each one of them, and then I would have to take them into the commander, and I'd say, "Hey sir, I've got this mission here, I've got this mission here, I've got this mission here. These are the resources. This is what you're short, but I need your prioritization so that we can move forward." And he would prioritize based off of his gut feeling or based off of his experience where he felt that the priorities should be, and that's how we arranged the missions. And we did what we had to do until we ran out of resources. And then when you ran out of resources, you might have to wait till the next day, to go out and do one of those other missions. So it's another concept in this book that when you first read it, you're like, that's so simple. But there's so much more to it. So it's a great book. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend that you read it. It's a real easy read. I read it in a couple of nights.
Yeah, the concept of even keeping it simple, and rather than going to some big elaborate plan, but just work on keeping it as simple as possible. Even for you, in your own organization, or as you're trying to bring other people along, don't make it so demanding and challenging and intricate that it takes forever to train somebody how to do it. Find ways to distill it down to be as simple as possible, so that you can move forward. It's a matter of wanting to move the organization forward quickly and efficiently. And so the more you can work to have those things, that KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid, right? That's a very common thing. You hear that, you mentioned one the other day, the 5 Bs.
The 5 Bs. Yeah, so to keep things simple, you want to have very effective communications, right? Whatever I'm projecting to you, you need to be able to understand it in the shortest amount of words possible, to the maximum intent. And I had a first sergeant who went on to be a very senior non-commissioned officer in the Army, who he was as country as cornbread. And he said, when you got up to speak, you need to speak and you need to remember the 5 Bs. And the 5 Bs were, be brief, brother, be brief. And I always kind of laughed about that, but it was, so many times people will get up and somebody will ask them what time it is, and they explain how the watch works. So rather than going into that level of detail, prioritize your information, tell them exactly what you got to tell them in the fewest amount of words possible. And then another great way to make sure that the simple plan is understood is ask for a back brief. So tell them what you just told them and say, okay, so let me repeat to me what you understood. Just, and it's not that you're insulting them and that they didn't understand what you were
Sure.
trying to put up. Maybe you didn't communicate it very well. I mean, there have been times where I have found that I've told somebody to do something and they did everything that I told them to do except for one thing here or there, and I go back and I'm like, but you didn't do this, and I didn't understand you wanted me to do that. So who is that faulting? Is that on them or is that on me? So it's never bad to get a back brief or a brief back. We call it back briefs in the military, to make sure that the receiver understands what the sender is trying to communicate.
Yeah. No, and that's this whole process, like you said, this kind of nested concepts of first understanding yourself and being a better leader yourself, and then how that impacts the way you interact with those that you're working with, the teams, and keeping it simple, the being brief. And I kind of laugh, I'm like, yeah, the 5 Bs, and even that is probably more than what you need, because it should be just be brief, brother.
Right.
Right. Or be brief. And then, but the 5 Bs.
But you always remember the 5 Bs.
Well, sure. Yeah, you do. And now I think, see, now this is where there's a whole other side of me that goes, and I still think there's a point of cultural context to this idea of being brief. Because in certain places, it's absolutely necessary, especially if it's a crisis situation, if the organization is in crisis, if something is happening, and whether it's a life and death type situation, or maybe it's the life and death of the business, to be brief and get the most important words out immediately must happen. But then there are other times where I do think you need to take more time and understand what's actually transpiring in the life of your people. And I think that the notion, and we kind of, is to feed back to a couple of things about other people in the organization or things not working well. There's a phrase or a word that, or a sentence that I usually try to pull back around, and that is never assume intent. When we are thinking about what that other person, and we start ascribing intent and ascribing intentions, well, they must have done it this way. What we're stating is that there were expectations that we had that they didn't do. And so it's a process of moving away from expectations and beginning to discuss agreements. Can we come to the table and have an agreement? I would like to agree with you that this is important. And so it's that back talk. Now, tell me, is this important to you? Let's agree on how we can do this more effectively. Maybe it's somebody who always shows up late to a meeting. And you want to say, look, it's important that you're there. I love your contributions. And when you arrive late, it disrupts everything else that's going on. So can we come to an agreement? I want you to agree with me that you will show up on time. And that conversation then transpires, rather than saying, well, I expect you to come. See, expectations is a whole other piece that if you come to that point, you never actually exceed expectations. And it's actually a depressing thing. You either expect things or you didn't meet expectations. But if you can come to that agreement, there's a very positive outcome that comes from that. And so I think this communication piece, all these ideas of being simple and just breaking it down to the bare bones things, and then at times understand that there is a need to say, okay, being brief, we actually missed some other pieces. Let's sit down and talk this out. But we need to come into that agreement together. I don't know if you want to speak to that from your experience, but
I want to talk about this intent piece because I think this is interesting, right?
Yeah.
So in the book, it doesn't really go into a lot of detail about something that was always very important to me, and we've talked about it multiple times. You hear me say it, and that's task, purpose, and intent. Mm-hmm. Let's use a construction analogy, and let's say that we asked Dan to go out and stack those bricks in the parking lot. Dan's probably going to go out and stack those bricks, but he may stack them across the parking lot. He may stack them this way. So we need to tell him, Dan, I need you to go stack those bricks because we're going to bring a truck through here in just a little bit. So now, rather than going really wide across the parking lot, he may stack them more taller so that there's room to drive a truck through. But then you need to also give him your intent. Dan, I want you to stack those bricks in the parking lot, and I want you to do it at the end of the driveway before 5 o'clock, because that's when the truck is going to get here. So I've given him task, purpose, and intent, and I've allowed him to take his team of however many he has and go out there and start to stack these bricks. So what have I left out? And I mentioned the brief back. Why is this important? So Dan, give me a brief back. Tell me what you want me to do. And he'll say, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to stack these bricks at the end of the driveway on the left side. No, not the left side. I wanted you to do it on the right side, because when the truck comes in, he's going to be on the right side of the driveway. Yeah. So who failed in the communication? Was it Dan, because Dan was going to stack them on the left side, or was it me because I didn't tell him? So as a leader, that's one of those things that's a valuable communication tool with you, is to follow up and make sure that they understood clearly what your intent was, because you may be so familiar with your communication that you don't understand that somebody else doesn't just automatically see it the same way that you do. It's kind of like when you're writing that term paper and you've read it 10 times and then you hand it to somebody else and ask them to read it, and you realize you got a misspelled word in the second sentence of the first paragraph, but you've read it so many times that it becomes you become blind to it. So it's one of those things where this is a huge it's an awesome way to communicate and ensure that the receivers understand what the sender is putting out. Yeah. So taking another step back, peeling that onion back one more layer. So we talk about empowerment and we talk about keeping things simple. Ultimately, you want to get people engaged at every level. So when people understand task, purpose, and intent, leaders at all levels now understand why they're doing what they're doing. So now Dan is going to go, and his team of 4 or 5 folks that he's got working with him, he's going to give them his task, purpose, and intent. And then there may be another subordinate leader. So you're creating depth and you're creating leadership. And you may have a formal leader and me telling Dan to go do this, and Dan is a formal leader. Then now all of a sudden you've got informal leaders in the organization that now understand how this tactical piece fits into a strategic puzzle.
Yeah. Thank you. That's then that notion of decentralized communication, decentralized leadership, and you can begin to see how this plays out in very simple ways to a very large organization, an intricate organization. So there was a question.
Yeah, when you said like there are times to speak more and there are times to be brief, I came up in the finance industry during the recession. And I worked for a few different companies, and there were ones that were willing to explain to their employees what was happening, and there were ones that were just like, okay, no overtime. And instead that came across of, what are you doing to my pay? Instead, the ones who explained, like, let's go into depth. This is why. If we just cut this, then no one loses their job. It's a different appreciation. I know as I've grown as a leader, sometimes I feel like I don't need to explain it to you. You just need to know. Just like the idea of orders over realizing this is part of a team. Like, and when that buy-in is in, it's like, okay, we're doing this for the good of all of us. Yeah. It's a much more powerful.
So with the be brief, brother, be brief thing, don't misinterpret that as that you just, hey, we're cutting overtime and no explanation, because then you're violating. You didn't give a task, you didn't give a purpose, and you didn't give an intent. So let's go back to the analogy with Dan, and I gave you my task, my purpose, and intent. We did a brief back. He understands what it is that I want to do. So what are some other facts or some other parts of this conversation that we could be putting in? The reason the truck is coming in is because we're going to landscape this back here. We're going to put 2 Japanese maples, 47 lilies. We're going to put in a rock wall. None of those facts are important to what Dan just needs to know that we need to bring a truck through. He doesn't necessarily need to know that, unless you deem as a leader that that's important. So I guess, it kind of goes back to the analogy, when somebody asks you what time it is, don't tell them how the watch works. Sometimes too much information can distract from the communication, because Dan may walk away from that and go, okay, so we're getting some Japanese maples and they're planting lilies, but where's this rock wall coming from? Are these bricks going to the rock wall? So it just completely skews the communication that you're, obviously I'm a career military person. I've been known to be very direct, and it's not that I try to be direct. It's that was the way I was trained, and that, commanders are very specific in how they want to do things, and that's something that I took away from the military, and that I do communicate probably more than I should sometimes. And for some of those that are watching, it's like, oh, I can guarantee you don't happen. But I always do try to be very direct and very open and very honest, and get to the point as quickly as possible. The term I like to use is the bottom line up front. Get that out there on the table, so that we make sure that we understand where we're going.
Yeah.
But you talk a little bit about decentralized command, and I thought that was a really interesting chapter in the book. So one of the things it talks about in here, and it kind of goes along with the empowerment and building the team, is decentralized command. And if you think back to the wars from 2001 up to present, you had huge deployments in Afghanistan, huge deployments in Iraq, and all over throughout the world. So military forces were spread really, really thin, and we used the analogy earlier where we talked about limited assets being available and having to get creative with using the resources that you had available.
Yeah.
So one of the things that the military did, which they had never done before, is they would divide up a company into 3 platoons, and they may put an infantry platoon with a tank battalion. They may put an infantry platoon with a field artillery, for whatever the mission was, because they at that point became combat multipliers. It gave you a more diverse look on the battlefield, able to adapt with flexibility and maintain the highest level of combat power. So that was a very interesting time in the military, because we had never done that before. We'd never divided people up. So now all of a sudden you've got a 24-year-old lieutenant who all he knows is his company commander, and now he's out here operating completely independent, and he had to learn that he was empowered, and he had to learn all these concepts at a level much lower than previously had been learned. So it kind of goes back to where we talk about the concept of empowerment and high performance work teams. That's exactly what this is right here. At MillerCoors, that's one of the things that we take a lot of pride in, is that we build high performance work teams. When I leave at the end of the day, there's no other managers in the building. And people are like, are you kidding me? You leave and there's nobody in there? And I'm like, nope, there's nobody in there. The technicians, the mechanics, the electricians, they run the business, and they're empowered to make decisions. They make decisions about their overtime, about their staffing. I mean, they run the business. And it doesn't happen overnight, because it goes back to one of the things we talked about in the very beginning. It's cultural, right? So culturally, you have to work very hard to get to that point. When we started this decentralized command, decentralized efforts in the very beginning in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was very hard to do that, because people just didn't understand what that was going to look like. And when you find it in the private sector, it becomes a very special thing. We've actually had companies reach out to us and say, how do you guys do that?
Wow.
Because it really helps with the bottom line. If you can if you can avoid having all the extra overhead of a salaried manager on every shift, because you've got technicians that can run it round the clock, that's a big thing.
Yeah. That's huge. Another question, and
Yes.
I'm realizing we're coming up on time, so I want to do we have more than one, or is it just okay?
This one.
All right.
Ted asks, looping back to the beginning, does a leader also have to be a manager, or can leaders emerge without a manager title?
So if I understand the question correctly, in every organization you have formal leaders, whether it's by position, by title, by role, but then you also have informal leaders that have influences on the organization. I know that in the military we had folks who weren't necessarily in senior leadership positions, but they were sought out for their expertise on a particular weapon system, or a particular tactic, or a particular capability. I think just like in industry, I know that we have people that are very experienced in terms of electrical programming. They may not necessarily be in a leadership role, but what they offer to the organization is invaluable because of their level of experience and expertise in a particular area, and they become informal leaders. So kind of goes back to the very beginning, inspire and influence, right? So to be a leader, you have to have the ability to get people to listen to you and inspire them to move in a particular direction. Managers typically are by position. I can't ever think of an informal manager. It may be out there, but I've personally never seen it. But I have seen a lot of informal leaders.
Yeah, that's a great distinction in even how you might have, yeah, an informal manager. You really don't hear that much. But you do have the informal leaders.
Sure.
That's very helpful. Any other questions or comments? Great. Well, thank you so much. We're gonna wrap up, and I want to let's see. Well, okay. So the conclusion, and actually this is let me just go to the conclusion slide for a second. And there's one in red. We didn't even touch on this, and I'm actually. Wow, Dan, could we go another hour? No, because this is crazy, but I think this also speaks to leadership, and it's that notion of it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. That hit me like a ton of bricks, because I think there was that notion for many times when I've heard or read things. It's you go through all these things and have people talk and you learn things, but it was a matter of it's what you tolerate. And so I want you to take some time to think about that, not only for those that you are in the process of maybe leading or reporting to, but think about that in your own life. And what is it that you are tolerating? What is it that you are allowing to happen that actually may be the very thing that's preventing you from getting to the next level in your own business, in your own work, in your own life? And what kind of things do you need to change to get to where you want to be? So I'm just going to leave that question with you and then flip over to what kind of light bulb moments or action steps can you take away from our conversation today? I'm really curious, because these are the kind of things that make a difference in the time that we spend together. It's not just about us sitting here for 90 minutes and talking about a book. The idea is for you to be able to take something away from here and to have a specific plan, a tangible plan, something that you can put into action today, tomorrow. Think about that. What is it that you can take from here today and put into action? And then our best intentions obviously are that we go out and do this, but I don't know about you, but I know I've got more meetings today. I've got phone calls and emails to deal with. I may very well forget everything that we talk about 5 minutes after we shut down. So I want you to take some time now, think about the things that you want to put into place in action. And those best intentions actually take root when we tell somebody else. So if you would like to be able to tell somebody and you don't have somebody to talk to, whether it's at work or somewhere else, if you do work with somebody at work and you say, hey, I need to tell you these things, do it. But if you don't, or you'd like to be able to work with me on that process, I can help you with that. In the next 3 hours, by 4:30 Eastern Standard Time. Send me an email or call me at the number that's on the screen, or you have it here, and give me your action step and the light bulb moments that you've had. Share them with me, and I will get in touch with you in the next day and a half. And we'll set a time to talk about it, and I'll help you get some of those action steps into place to move you forward into the next level that you want to get to. Marc, thank you. This has been huge and tremendous, and really, really grateful. Again, thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate your willingness to just take this and help flesh it out to what it's meant for you and your opportunities to work. Thank you for allowing us to be here. Dan with the Greater Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Next month, August 20th. So we went a little late in July, and we're going to go a little earlier in August for Daniel Pink. And I'll just thank you, Stan. Daniel Pink, To Sell is Human. That's the book for next month. To Sell is to Human. To Sell is to Human. To Sell is Human. Daniel Pink. And we're going to discuss sales and communication. It's not just the idea that you have a sales team, it's the fact that everybody needs to know how to sell. And when you begin to understand that selling is human, it helps a lot. So we're going to discuss that next month and look forward to having you at the next conversation. Thank you.